The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a mechanical prayer, casting that sickly hospital glow across the empty chairs in the waiting room. I sat there, clutching my purse so tightly my knuckles had turned white, watching strangers in scrubs hurry past with purpose while I remained frozen in place. The smell of disinfectant mixed with fear hung heavy in the air, but what suffocated me wasn't the sterile atmosphere. It was the crushing realization that I was completely alone in what should have been the most important moment of my daughter's life. Sarah was somewhere behind those double doors, making decisions about her surgery, her future, her life. And I, the woman who had brought her into this world, who had held her through countless childhood fevers and nightmare-filled nights, was sitting here like a stranger. The nurse had been polite but firm when I asked for information. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're not listed as an emergency contact." The words had hit me like ice water. 32 years of motherhood, and I wasn't even on the list. My name is Eleanor, though most people just call me Ellie. I'm 63 years old, and until this moment, I believed that being a mother was the most important thing I'd ever done. I had built my entire identity around it, shaped every decision around it, sacrificed everything for it. But sitting in that boarding room, surrounded by the quiet desperation of other families in crisis, I finally understood a truth that had been staring me in the face for years. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes, despite giving everything you have, you can still end up with nothing. The autumn rain was beating against the hospital windows, each drop like a tiny fist demanding attention. It reminded me of another October day, 28 years ago, when Sarah was 4 and had fallen from the monkey bars at the elementary school playground. That day, I was the first person they called. I was the one who held her while she cried, the one who stayed up all night watching for signs of concussion. I was her world then, her safe harbor, her everything. How did we go from there to here? I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when I stopped being essential and started being expendable. The truth was, it hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone, so gradual that I had convinced myself it was normal, even healthy. Children grow up, I told myself. They need space to become their own people, but there's a difference between healthy independence and complete exclusion, and I was finally ready to admit which side of that line I was on. The waiting room was filled with the kind of silence that only exists in hospitals, where hope and despair sit side by side in uncomfortable plastic chairs. An elderly man in the corner was reading a newspaper with shaking hands, probably waiting for news about his wife. A young couple near the vending machines whispered urgently to each other, their faces etched with worry. And then there was me, the forgotten mother, the woman who had somehow become invisible in her own daughter's story. My phone buzzed, and for a moment my heart leaped. Maybe it was Sarah, maybe it was Sarah, maybe she needed me after all. But it was just a spam call. Another reminder that even telemarketers had better access to my attention than my own child. I set the phone down and stared at the motivational poster on the wall across from me. "Family is forever," it proclaimed in cheerful blue letters above. A stock photo of smiling faces. The irony wasn't lost on me. I thought about calling my sister Margaret, but what would I say? That I was sitting in a hospital waiting room while my daughter underwent surgery, and nobody had bothered to tell me what was wrong. That I had found out about the operation through a casual mention from our neighbor, who had seen Sarah's husband loading overnight bags into their car. The shame of it was almost worse than the hurt. Almost. The automatic doors whooshed open, and a family burst through, all urgent voices and worried faces. They moved with the kind of coordinated purpose that comes from being truly connected, from being essential to each other, the way I thought Sarah and I used to be, the way I had fooled myself into believing we still were, even as the evidence mounted that I had become nothing more than an obligation to be managed, a duty to be discharged. I had raised Sarah alone, after her father died when she was 8. David's heart attack had been sudden, devastating, leaving us both reeling in a world that suddenly seemed too big and too dangerous. But we had each other. We were a team, a unit, an unbreakable bond, forged in grief and strengthened by necessity. Or so I thought. Maybe the truth was that I had needed her more than she had ever needed me, and the moment she was old enough to realize it, she began her slow but steady retreat. If someone had asked me an hour ago what I would call the most difficult period of my life, I would have said it was those early years after David's death. Working double shifts at St. Mary's Hospital, coming home exhausted to help with homework, missing parent-teacher conferences because I couldn't leave the ICU during a crisis, but those years, hard as they were, had purpose. Every sacrifice had meaning because it was building toward something, toward the moment when Sarah would be established, successful, and we could finally have the close adult relationship I had always dreamed of. The dream was simple enough: Sunday dinners where she would tell me about her work as a pediatric nurse, just like I had once told her about mine, grandchildren who would call me Nana and spend weekends baking cookies in my kitchen, shopping trips where we would laugh about nothing and everything, the way mothers and daughters do in movies. A friendship built on the foundation of all those years when it was just the two of us against the world. Instead, I got polite distance and scheduled phone calls that felt more like check-ins than conversations. I got holiday invitations that came with expiration dates and escape clauses. I got a daughter who loved me, I think, but who had clearly decided that love was best expressed from a safe distance, preferably with her husband's family, as a buffer between us. The realization that you've become the relative people tolerate, rather than treasure, doesn't come all at once. It creeps up on you in small moments, tiny rejections that you explain away, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The first sign had been so subtle I almost missed it. Sarah had started saying we when she used to say I. We think you might enjoy this restaurant. We were wondering if you wanted to come to the barbecue. We decided to spend Christmas in Colorado this year. At first, I was thrilled that she and Michael were so united, so clearly committed to building a life together. It wasn't until much later that I realized the we never included me. I was being informed of decisions, not consulted about them. I was being invited to participate in a life that had already been planned and executed without my input. I had become a guest in my own daughter's world, and not even an important one. The coffee in the hospital cafeteria was terrible, but I needed something to do with my hands, some reason to move through the motions of being alive while I processed the magnitude of my The paper cup was warm against my palms as I walked back to the waiting area, past families who belonged there, who had information and updates and roles to play in their loved ones' care. I had tried to convince myself that this was normal, that modern families were just different from the close-knit units I had grown up with. My mother had been the center of our family universe, the sun around which we all orbited. Even after I married David, even after I had Sarah, my mother's opinion mattered. Her presence was requested, her involvement was assumed. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I had expected from Sarah what I had given to my own mother, and maybe that expectation had driven her away. The truth was more complicated than that, though. It wasn't just that Sarah had grown independent. It was that she had actively chosen a different family to be dependent on. Michael's parents, Barbara and Robert, had become her primary advisors, her go-to support system, her chosen family. They were the ones consulted about major purchases, vacation plans, career decisions. They were the ones who knew about the surgery before I did. I first noticed it at Sarah's wedding 3 years ago. The seating chart had me at table 7, while Barbara and Robert sat at the head table with the wedding party. During the reception, I watched Barbara help Sarah with her dress, fix her makeup, whisper advice in her ear. I watched Robert walk her around the room, introducing her to his business associates like she was his own daughter. And I sat at table 7, making polite conversation with David's elderly aunt and some college friends I barely knew. When I mentioned it to Sarah later, she looked genuinely confused. "Mom, you seemed to be having a great time at your table. I didn't want to burden you with all the wedding stress." Burden, that's what my involvement had become in her mind. Not an honor or a privilege or a natural right, but a burden to be managed and minimized. That the pattern continued after the wedding. Barbara went dress shopping with Sarah for her work wardrobe. Robert helped them buy their first house, co-signing the loan when Sarah's credit wasn't quite sufficient. When they needed someone to watch their dog during their honeymoon, they asked Michael's brother. When Sarah got food poisoning from a restaurant, she called Barbara to take her to urgent care. When they decided to start trying for children, Barbara was the first to know. I learned about most of these things secondhand, through casual mentions in our brief phone conversations, or through social media posts that felt like public announcements of my exclusion. Each revelation was a small paper cut, barely noticeable individually but collectively creating a wound that wouldn't heal. The worst part wasn't even the exclusion itself. It was the way Sarah seemed genuinely surprised when I expressed hurt about it. "Mom, I didn't think you'd want to be bothered with every little thing." she would say, as if caring about her life was an imposition rather than an instinct. You're always so busy with work, she would add, despite the fact that I had cut back my hours specifically to be more available to her. I had retired early, at 60, thinking that would give us more time together. Instead, it seemed to give her more permission to leave me out. Without the excuse of my work schedule, my exclusion became even more pointed, even more intentional. They couldn't claim I was too busy anymore. They could only claim they didn't want me there. The boarding room was getting busier as the afternoon wore on. More families, more worry, more proof that most people had someone who considered them essential. I watched a teenager hold his grandmother's hand while they waited for news about her test results. I watched a woman about my age pace nervously while her husband was in surgery, their adult children taking turns bringing her coffee and reassurance. I had imagined myself in their place so many times, being the necessary presence during Sarah's moments of crisis and celebration. Instead, I was the optional extra, the person who might be informed after the fact if someone remembered to call. The person who had to find out about her own daughter's surgery from a neighbor who had noticed unusual activity next door. The notification had come on a Tuesday morning. I was watering the plants on my front porch when Mrs. Chen from across the street came over with her usual friendly smile and devastating small talk. I saw Sarah and Michael loading up their car yesterday evening, she said. Looked like they were heading to the hospital. I hope everything's okay. Everything was not okay, but not in the way Mrs. Chen meant. Everything was not okay because my daughter was facing some kind of medical crisis and hadn't thought to tell me. Everything was not okay because I had to pretend to Mrs. Chen that I knew all about it, that I was completely informed and involved. Everything was not okay because I spent the rest of that day calling Sarah's phone and getting voicemail, texting Michael and receiving no response, even calling the hospital and being told they couldn't give me any information. It wasn't until Wednesday afternoon that Sarah finally called me back. Her voice was tired but casual, as if she were reporting on the weather rather than explaining why she had disappeared for 2 days. Oh, Mom, I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. I'm having some minor surgery on Friday, nothing serious. Michael's parents are here helping out, so everything's covered, as if I were a service to be replaced rather than a mother, to be included, as if my love and concern were interchangeable with hired help or as if 32 years of being her person counted for nothing when it really mattered. I had driven to the hospital anyway, of course, not because I was invited or expected, but because some instincts run deeper than hurt feelings. Despite everything, despite all the evidence that my presence was neither wanted nor needed, I couldn't stay away when my child was in pain. So here I sat, in a waiting room where I didn't belong, hoping for news about someone who had clearly decided I had no right to receive it. The irony was that I had spent my entire career taking care of other people's family members. As a nurse, I had been the bridge between medical teams and worried relatives. I had held the hands of countless mothers, fathers, spouses, and children while they waited for news about their loved ones. I had always made sure families were informed, included, treated with the dignity and respect that comes from being essential to someone's life. And now, I was on the other side, being treated like an outsider in my own daughter's medical crisis. A young doctor emerged from the double doors, looking around the waiting room with the kind of purposeful scan that meant he was looking for specific people. My heart jumped, but his eyes passed right over me, landing on a family near the windows. They gathered around him eagerly, faces tight with worry and hope. I watched them receive whatever news he had to share, watched their expressions shift from anxiety to relief, watched them embrace each other in the kind of moment I should have been part of. I thought about the conversation Sarah and I had never quite had, the one where she might have explained when and why I had become expendable. Maybe it started when she went away to college and discovered that other families operated differently. Maybe it began when she met Michael and saw how his parents related to him with more boundaries and less intensity than I had ever managed. Maybe it was something I had done or failed to do, some crucial moment when I should have pulled back instead of holding on, or held on instead of pulling back. The truth was probably simpler and more painful than any specific moment or decision. The truth was probably that I had loved her too much, needed her too much, built too much of my identity around being her mother. And when she grew up and tried to establish her own identity, Mine felt like a threat to hers. My love felt like a cage. My involvement felt like interference. My need for closeness felt like suffocation. But understanding something doesn't make it hurt less. Knowing that I had probably played a role in my own exile didn't make the exile any easier to bear. Sitting in that waiting room, surrounded by families who belonged there, I felt the full weight of my own irrelevance. I was a mother without a child who needed mothering, a caregiver with no one to care for, a woman whose most important relationship had somehow become her least significant one. The afternoon was wearing on, and I knew I should probably leave. I wasn't going to get any information, wasn't going to be needed or wanted. Sarah had her chosen family with her, the people she had decided were worthy of her trust and inclusion. I was just taking up a chair that could be used by someone who actually belonged there, but I couldn't quite bring myself to go. Despite everything, despite all the evidence that my presence was unwanted and unnecessary, I couldn't leave my daughter in a hospital without at least trying to be there for her, even if she didn't want me there, even if my being there made no difference to anyone but me. So I stayed, watching the clock tick away the hours, watching other families come and go, watching my phone for updates that never came. I stayed because sometimes love means showing up even when you're not invited, even when you're not wanted, even when it changes nothing. I stayed because being a mother isn't something you can resign from, even when your child has clearly decided to replace you. As the sun began to set outside the hospital windows, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of Sarah's nursery walls so many years ago, I finally allowed myself to cry, not the dramatic sobs of fresh grief, but the quiet tears of long-delayed recognition. I cried for the relationship I thought we had, for the future I thought we were building. For the woman I had been before I realized how little I mattered, to the person who mattered most to me. And then, because crying in hospital waiting rooms doesn't actually solve anything, I dried my eyes and made a decision. I would go home. I would stop waiting for news that wasn't meant for me, stop hoping for inclusion that clearly wasn't coming. I would go home and figure out how to be someone other than Sarah's mother, how to build a life that didn't depend on being essential to someone who had decided I was expendable. The next morning brought the news I had been waiting for, delivered, not by Sarah or Michael or even the hospital, but by Mrs. Chen, who had seen them return home. She must be feeling better, Mrs. Chen said cheerfully. I saw her walking to the mailbox this morning, and just like that, I learned that my daughter had survived whatever crisis had required surgery, that she was home and recovering, that the worst was over, and I had missed all of it. I should have felt relief, but what I felt was something closer to grief. The crisis had passed, and I hadn't been needed for any of it. Sarah had faced something difficult and potentially dangerous, and she had done it without me. She had chosen to do it without me. The realization settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and permanent and impossible to ignore. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister Margaret and told her the truth. Not the sanitized version I usually offered, where everything was fine and Sarah was just busy with her own life. The real truth, messy and painful and embarrassing as it was. I think I've lost her, I said, and Margaret's silence on the other end of the line confirmed what I already knew. She had seen it too, had been waiting for me to acknowledge what everyone else had already figured out. "Oh, honey," Margaret finally said, her voice soft with sympathy and something that might have been relief that I was finally ready to face reality. "I think maybe it's time to stop trying so hard to be needed and start figuring out how to be happy on your own." The conversation with Margaret was the beginning of something new, though I didn't recognize it at the time. It was the beginning of my recovery from an addiction I hadn't even known I had. The addiction to being essential to someone who no longer wanted me to be. It was the beginning of learning how to love Sarah without needing her to love me back. In the same way, without needing her to include me in her life in order for me to feel valuable. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were still moments when I reached for my phone to call her about something trivial. Still times when I had to stop myself from dropping by unannounced. Still holidays when I waited for invitations that came later and later each year, if they came at all. But gradually, slowly, I began to build a life that didn't revolve around being her mother. I started volunteering at the hospital where I used to work, spending time with patients who had no family visitors, being the essential presence for people who had no one else to be essential to them. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during the years when Sarah was my whole world. I took up painting, something I had always wanted to try but never had time for when all my time belonged to someone else. And strangest of all, I began to enjoy my own company. I had spent so many years defining myself in relation to other people, first as David's wife and then as Sarah's mother, that I had forgotten who I was underneath all those roles. Rediscovering that person was both terrifying and liberating, like meeting a stranger who turned out to be surprisingly good company. The boarding room moment, as I came to think of it, had been devastating, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes, you have to lose yourself completely before you can find yourself again. Sometimes you have to sit alone in a waiting room, surrounded by families who actually belong there, before you can understand that belonging somewhere doesn't require anyone else's permission. Sarah and I still talk, though less frequently and more carefully than we used to. Our conversations are polite, surface level, the kind of maintenance communication that keeps relationships technically intact without risking any real intimacy. She tells me about her work, I tell her about my volunteer activities. She mentions upcoming trips, I mention books I'm reading. We exchange birthday cards and Christmas gifts and the occasional text message. It's not the relationship I dreamed of, but it's the relationship she's willing to have, and I've learned to find peace in that. I've learned that loving someone doesn't give you the right to a place in their life, and that accepting their choices, even when those choices exclude you, might be the most loving thing you can do. The hardest part wasn't accepting that Sarah didn't need me the way I needed to be needed. The hardest part was accepting that this was probably better for both of us. My intense need to be essential had been a burden for her, a weight she couldn't carry while also trying to build her own adult life. My stepping back, however painful, had given her the space she needed to be fully herself, and it had given me something too, something I hadn't expected to find in the ruins of my most important relationship. It had given me myself back, the woman I was before I became a wife and mother, the woman I might have been if I hadn't defined myself entirely through my relationships with other people. That woman, it turned out, was pretty interesting company. Now, when I sit in waiting rooms, it's because I've chosen to be there, volunteering with families who need support during their own medical crises. I'm not the forgotten mother anymore, sitting alone and hoping for news that isn't meant for me. I'm the helper, the person who brings coffee and tissues and a calm presence to people who are facing their own boarding room moments. And sometimes, when I see a mother sitting alone while her adult child faces surgery without her, I sit down beside her and say quietly, "You're not invisible, you're just learning to be seen differently." Because the truth I learned in that boarding room, the truth that saved me even as it broke my heart, is that being essential to someone and being essential to yourself are two very different things, and only one of them is really under your control. The boarding room taught me that there's a difference between being alone and being lonely, between being excluded and being free. It taught me that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is learn to love ourselves enough to let go of relationships that only exist on our terms. Sarah is happy, I think. She has the life she wanted, the space she needed, the family she chose, and I am learning to be happy too, in ways I never expected when my whole world revolved around being needed by someone who had outgrown needing me. It's a different kind of happiness, quieter and more independent. But it's real, and it's mine, and it doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or inclusion. The boarding room was where I realized there was no place for me in her life, but it was also where I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was finally a place for me in my own life. And that place, it turned out, was exactly where I belonged. What started as the most painful realization of my life became the beginning of the most honest relationship I'd ever had, the one with myself. The boarding room was empty, but I wasn't. I was full of possibilities I had never considered, full of love that didn't need a specific recipient to be meaningful, full of worth that didn't depend on being indispensable to someone else. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever sat in your own version of that boarding room, wondering how you became so expendable to someone you love so much, I want you to know that your story doesn't end there. The boarding room isn't the destination. It's just the place where you finally stopped pretending everything is fine and start building something that actually is. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced feeling invisible in your own family? How did you find your way back to yourself? Your stories matter, and I read every comment. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about the complicated truths of family, love, and finding yourself when everything you thought you knew falls apart.